The winter of 1937 settled over Manhattan like a cold, unforgiving hand. Snow fell in thick curtains across the narrow streets of Little Italy, muffling the sounds of the city and casting the neighborhood in shades of gray and white. Steam rose from manhole covers, mingling with the smoke from coal furnaces, while icicles hung like daggers from fire escapes that zigzagged up the sides of brick tenement buildings. This was a world unto itself, where Italian immigrants had carved out their piece of America, bringing with them the old country's traditions, its language, its food, and its codes of honor and silence. On Mulberry Street, beneath the awning of a modest Italian social club called the Bella Napoli, men in heavy wool overcoats and fedoras gathered despite the bitter cold. Their breath formed white clouds as they spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing up and down the street with practiced caution. To the casual observer, they might have seemed like ordinary working men seeking warmth and companionship, but the neighborhood knew better. Everyone in Little Italy understood that these men answered to one person, and that person's word was law in these 20 square blocks of Manhattan. Vito Genovese sat in the back room of the Bella Napoli, a space perpetually thick with cigar smoke and the rich aroma of espresso. The room was decorated simply: dark wood paneling, a few religious icons on the walls, and a large table where business was conducted. At 40 years old, Vito possessed a presence that filled any room he entered. He wasn't particularly tall, standing at 5'7", but his broad shoulders and thick chest spoke of physical strength. His face was hard and angular, with dark eyes that seemed to penetrate whoever they fixed upon. Those eyes had witnessed poverty in Naples, the brutal streets of New York's immigrant neighborhoods, and the violent rise through the criminal underworld. They had seen men beg for mercy and had watched without blinking as that mercy was denied. Today, Vito wore a tailored three-piece suit in charcoal gray, a gold watch chain visible across his vest. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and a diamond ring glinted on his right pinky finger. Everything about his appearance communicated success and power. He had come far from the barefoot boy who arrived at Ellis Island in 1913, and he intended for everyone to know it. The shipment from New Jersey arrives Thursday night, said Mike Miranda, one of Vito's most trusted associates, leaning forward across the table. Miranda was lean and nervous, his fingers constantly moving, tapping the table or adjusting his tie. 3 trucks, like we discussed. The cops at the docks have been handled. Vito nodded slowly, drawing on his cigar. And the distribution to the speakeasies uptown? Already arranged, boss, Miranda replied quickly. We've got 6 new locations in Harlem ready to take product. The colored clubs are paying premium prices since the Irish backed off, despite prohibition having ended 4 years earlier. The infrastructure built during those dry years still thrived. The networks established for smuggling illegal alcohol had simply pivoted to other enterprises: gambling operations, labor racketeering, loan sharking, and protection rackets. Vito had been instrumental in building these networks, working his way up through the ranks of what the newspapers were starting to call the Luciano crime family, named after Charles Lucky Luciano, the visionary who had modernized organized crime in New York. But everyone in the room knew that Vito Genovese was the muscle behind Luciano's brains. While Lucky handled the politics and the connections with other families, Vito enforced discipline. He was the one who personally oversaw the most important operations, who made examples of those who showed disloyalty, who commanded absolute respect through a careful balance of generosity and ruthlessness. Anthony "Tony" Bender, Strollo, entered the room, bringing with him a gust of cold air and snowflakes that melted on his coat. Tony was a massive man, well over 6 feet, and built like a boxer, which he had been in his youth. His nose had been broken multiple times, giving his face a permanently aggressive appearance. But those who knew him understood that Tony's real talent wasn't physical violence. It was his genius for numbers and logistics. "Vito," Tony said, removing his fedora and shaking the snow from it. "We got a problem with the union situation at the garment factories." Vito's expression didn't change, but everyone in the room felt the temperature drop. "Explain." "The shop stewards are getting pressure from some of the workers. They want actual improvements, shorter hours, better conditions. A few of them are talking about going to the real unions, maybe even the feds." The garment district was one of Vito's most profitable operations. By controlling the unions through intimidation and strategic placement of loyalists, they could extract regular payments from factory owners who preferred paying protection money to dealing with labor strikes. It was a perfect system that generated thousands of dollars weekly with minimal effort. Vito set down his cigar, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Who's leading this?" "Guy named Samuel Weiss. He's a cutter, been working the factories for 20 years. Old school socialist type, thinks he can organize the workers." "Jewish?" Vito asked. Tony nodded. "Yeah, but he's got support from some of the Italian workers too. That's what makes it dangerous." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what needed to happen, but nobody wanted to speak first. Vito had built his reputation on making hard decisions without hesitation, but he also valued input from his men. It created the illusion of democracy, while maintaining absolute authority. "Here's what we do," Vito finally said, his voice calm and measured. "Tony, you reach out to Weiss, friendly-like. Take him to dinner at Angelo's. Show him respect. Explain that we appreciate his concern for the workers and that we're willing to negotiate some small improvements. Make him feel heard." Tony looked confused. "Boss, I thought—" Vito raised a hand, silencing him. "If he takes the offer, we give the workers a tiny raise, barely noticeable to the owners. We make Weiss look like a hero, then we control him, we own him. He becomes our man on the inside, and the workers trust him even more." "And if he doesn't take the offer?" Mike Miranda asked, though everyone already knew the answer. Vito's eyes went cold. "Then he has an accident, a workplace accident. Something tragic but not suspicious. The factory owners have been cutting corners on safety anyway. Wouldn't be hard to arrange. But we try the smart way first. Violence is expensive and draws attention. Better to turn an enemy into an asset." This was the essence of Vito's approach to business. He was perfectly willing to use force, but he preferred solutions that were clean, subtle, and profitable. It was this calculated pragmatism that had made him indispensable to the organization. The meeting continued for another hour, covering various operations across the city. There were discussions about the numbers racket in the Bronx, a dispute with a rival crew over territory in Brooklyn, and plans to expand their loan sharking operation to target small business owners in Queens. Every decision was made methodically, with Vito weighing the risks and benefits, always thinking 3 moves ahead. When the meeting finally concluded, the men filed out one by one, disappearing into the snowy streets. Vito remained seated, lighting a fresh cigar and pouring himself a small glass of anisette. These moments of solitude were rare and precious. In this brief window, he could think without interruption, could assess his position, and plan his next moves. The truth was that Vito Genovese was not content with being second in command. Lucky Luciano was brilliant, no question, but he was also flashy and attracted too much attention. The federal prosecutors were building cases, and it was only a matter of time before Lucky's luck ran out. When that happened, Vito intended to be ready to step into the void. But there were obstacles beyond the organizational chart. Personal obstacles. His wife, Donata, had been growing increasingly difficult. They had married 16 years ago, back when Vito was still establishing himself. Still hungry and dangerous, but not yet powerful. Donata had been the daughter of a respected family from the neighborhood, and the marriage had provided Vito with important connections. She had given him 2 daughters, maintained his household, and played the role of a dutiful mafia wife, hosting dinners, attending church, never asking questions about his business. But lately, Donata had become resentful. She complained about his long absences, about the rumors of his affairs, about the danger his lifestyle brought to their doorstep. She had started making threats, veiled at first, but growing more explicit. Threats about talking to lawyers, about divorce, about taking his money and his children and leaving him publicly humiliated. Vito's jaw tightened at the thought. In his world, a man's reputation was everything. To be seen as unable to control his own household would undermine his authority. His enemies would smell weakness, and weakness in this business was fatal. The door to the back room opened and a young man entered. Peter DeFeo, one of Vito's newer associates, eager and loyal, but still learning the ropes. "Boss, your car is ready. Your wife called the club. She says you promised to be home for dinner tonight." Vito checked his watch, a gold Patek Philippe that had cost more than most men in the neighborhood earned in a year. It was already past 7. He had indeed promised to be home, though he couldn't remember why it had seemed important at the time. "Tell Carmine to bring the car around," Vito said, standing and adjusting his coat. "I'll be out in a minute." As Peter left, Vito stood before the small mirror hanging near the door, straightening his tie and adjusting his fedora. The man who looked back at him was powerful, feared, and wealthy. He controlled an empire that generated more money than he could spend. Politicians sought his favor. Businessmen paid him tribute, and his enemies disappeared in the night. Yet he was about to go home to a wife who looked at him with contempt, who dared to challenge him, who threatened the very foundation of the respect he had built. The snow had intensified by the time Vito stepped out onto Mulberry Street. His driver, Carmine Galante, a young man with cold eyes and a reputation for efficiency, stood beside a black Cadillac V16, its engine running to keep the interior warm. Carmine opened the rear door, and Vito slid into the leather seat. As the car pulled away from the curb, Vito looked out at his kingdom. The streets of Little Italy were alive, despite the weather. Women hurried home from market, clutching bags of groceries. Children threw snowballs, their laughter cutting through the winter air. Shop owners swept snow from their storefronts, their breath visible in the cold. This was his world, and these were his people. They depended on him for protection, for order, for justice when the American legal system failed them. The car turned onto Mott Street, passing the church where Vito had been married, where he attended Mass every Sunday morning, sitting in the front pew like a respectable businessman. The priest there, Father Russo, knew exactly what Vito did for a living but never questioned it. The church received generous donations, and in return, Father Russo provided spiritual cover and asked no uncomfortable questions. This was the way of Little Italy, a world where the old country's values still held sway, where family and respect meant everything, where disputes were settled privately rather than involving the authorities. It was a world Vito understood completely, a world he had helped shape and maintain. The Cadillac continued uptown, leaving Little Italy behind and entering more prosperous neighborhoods. Vito had moved his family out of the tenements years ago, purchasing a substantial townhouse on the Upper West Side. It was a statement of his success, a visible symbol that he had transcended his origins. The house had 4 stories, servants' quarters, and a view of the Hudson River. Donata had decorated it in the style she imagined wealthy Americans lived. Heavy furniture, crystal chandeliers, oriental rugs, but no amount of expensive decoration could hide the tension that had come to define their marriage. As the car pulled up in front of the townhouse, Vito could see warm light glowing from the windows. Somewhere inside, dinner was waiting, and so was his wife, probably with a list of grievances and complaints. The thought filled him with a cold anger that he carefully suppressed. In business, emotion was a liability. Decisions had to be made rationally, based on costs and benefits, risks, and rewards. Perhaps it was time to start thinking about his marriage the same way. The front door of the townhouse opened before Vito could reach for his keys. Maria, the housekeeper, stood in the doorway, her round face showing the careful neutrality of a servant who had learned never to involve herself in family disputes. She was a widow from Sicily, grateful for the employment and the comfortable room on the 4th floor, and she knew better than to comment on the raised voices that sometimes echoed through the elegant halls. "Good evening, Mr. Genovese," she said quietly, taking his coat and fedora. "Dinner is ready, Mrs. Genovese is waiting in the dining room." Vito nodded, handing her his coat and brushing snow from his shoulders. The interior of the house was warm, almost oppressively so. Radiators clanked and hissed, fighting against the February cold. The entrance hall was decorated with dark wood paneling and expensive paintings that Donata had purchased from galleries in Midtown, European landscapes and still lifes that were supposed to demonstrate culture and refinement. He could hear his daughters upstairs, their voices carrying down from the 2nd floor. Marie was 14 now, and Antoinette 12. They were good girls, obedient and respectful, attending a private Catholic school where the other parents whispered about their father's reputation, but never said anything directly. Money had a way of softening people's moral objections. The dining room was at the rear of the house, overlooking a small garden that was now buried under snow. The table was set for 2 with fine china and silver candlesticks. Donata sat at the far end, her posture rigid, her hands folded in her lap. At 38, she was still an attractive woman, with dark hair styled in the fashion of the day, pulled back from her face in waves. She wore a burgundy dress with pearls at her throat, jewelry Vito had given her for their 15th anniversary. But her eyes, once warm and welcoming, had grown cold and distant. "You're late," she said without preamble. Again. Vito took his seat at the head of the table, unfolding his napkin with deliberate calm. "Business kept me longer than expected. The weather made everything more complicated." "Business?" Donata repeated, the word dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what you call her?" The question hung in the air between them. Maria appeared with a tureen of minestrone, serving the soup with practiced efficiency, while pretending not to hear the conversation. The housekeeper's presence provided a temporary buffer, forcing both of them to maintain a veneer of civility. Once Maria had retreated to the kitchen, Donata leaned forward, her voice low but intense. "Don't insult me by pretending you don't know what I'm talking about, Vito. The whole neighborhood knows. Anna Patillo. Everyone sees you with her. Everyone talks. Anna Patillo." The name itself was like a match to dry kindling. She was 24 years old, 17 years younger than Vito, with the kind of beauty that turned heads on the street. Dark hair that fell in luxurious waves, green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and mischief, and a figure that made men forget their marriage vows. She had been married for 3 years to Gerard Vernotico, a low-level associate who ran a small gambling operation in the Bronx. Vito had first encountered Anna at a wedding the previous summer. She had been sitting at a table with other wives, but unlike them, she hadn't looked bored or resigned. She had been laughing, genuinely engaged with the people around her, full of life and energy. When their eyes met across the room, something had shifted. It wasn't just attraction, though that was certainly present. It was recognition. 2 people who understood that they were meant for something more than what they currently had. The affair had begun discreetly, meeting in apartments owned by friends, in hotel rooms in New Jersey where nobody would recognize them, but discretion could only go so far in a community as tight-knit as Little Italy. Whispers spread like wildfire, and soon everyone knew that Vito Genovese had a mistress, and that the mistress was the wife of another man in the organization. "I don't know what gossip you've been listening to," Vito said, tasting the soup without looking at his wife. "People talk because they have nothing better to do." Donata's laugh was bitter. "You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know what you are, what you do? I've known since the beginning, Vito. I accepted it. I never complained when you came home late, when you disappeared for days, when the police came asking questions. I kept this house, I raised your daughters, I smiled and played the dutiful wife at every wedding and funeral and christening." She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "But this? Parading around with that girl where everyone can see? Making me look like a fool? That I won't accept." Vito set down his spoon, his patience beginning to fray. "Watch your tone, Donata. Remember who you're speaking to." "I'm speaking to my husband," she shot back, her voice rising. "Or what's left of him. The man I married had honor. He had respect for his family. He understood loyalty." The hypocrisy of it struck Vito like a physical blow. Loyalty? She dared to lecture him about loyalty when he had built everything they had, when he had elevated her from a nobody's daughter to the wife of one of the most powerful men in New York. Every piece of jewelry she wore, every piece of furniture in this house, the very food on this table, all of it came from his work. His risks, his willingness to do what needed to be done. "You want to talk about loyalty?" Vito said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I've provided everything for you. This house, the private school for the girls, the clothes on your back, the servants, the car, everything. And what do I get in return? Complaints, accusations, disrespect in my own home." Donata stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "What you get in return? You get a wife who has stood by you through everything, who has never questioned where the money comes from, who has never told you no, who has—" She stopped suddenly, her hand going to her mouth as if she had said too much. But Vito had caught the implication, and rage flooded through him. "Who has what?" he demanded, rising to his feet. "Say it. Say what you're thinking. Who has stayed silent when she could have spoken?" Donata finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who could go to the authorities if she wanted to? Who knows things, Vito? Things that could cause you very serious problems." The threat was unmistakable. In that moment, the woman standing before him was no longer his wife but an adversary, someone who had just revealed herself as a potential danger to everything he had built. In his world, such threats were met with immediate and decisive action, but this was his wife, the mother of his children, standing in their home. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to regain control of his emotions. Losing his temper now would accomplish nothing. "You should be very careful about what you say next," Vito said, his voice like ice. "Think very carefully, Donata." She seemed to recognize that she had crossed a line. Some of the defiance left her posture, replaced by something that might have been fear, though she tried to hide it. "I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you that I won't be humiliated anymore. I want a divorce." There it was, the word that had been circling their conversations for months, finally spoken aloud. Divorce. In their world, among their people, divorce was almost unheard of. It was shameful, a public admission of failure. More importantly, it was expensive. "No," Vito said flatly. "There will be no divorce. You don't have a choice," Donata insisted, though her voice wavered. "I've already spoken to a lawyer, a good one. He says I'm entitled to half of everything. The house, the businesses, all of it, and I want custody of the girls." Vito felt a cold fury settle over him. She had gone to a lawyer. She had discussed his business, his finances, his private affairs with a stranger. Every instinct screamed at him to end this threat immediately, but he forced himself to think strategically. "What lawyer?" he asked, his tone conversational now, almost friendly. Donata hesitated, recognizing the trap. If she gave the name, that lawyer would receive a visit from men who would explain very clearly why taking this case would be bad for his health. If she refused to answer, she revealed her own fear and weakness. "That doesn't matter," she finally said. "What matters is that I'm serious. I want out, Vito. I want to take my daughters and leave this life behind. I want to go somewhere safe, somewhere normal, where we don't have to worry about police raids or rival gangs or finding you dead in an alley somewhere. The girls stay here," Vito said immediately. "You want to leave? Fine, but my daughters stay with me." "They're my daughters too." Donata's voice cracked with emotion. "I won't leave them with you, with this life. They deserve better. Better than what I've given them?" Vito gestured around the elegant dining room. "You think they'd be better off poor? Living in some tiny apartment while their mother works as a seamstress? You think that's what they deserve?" "I think they deserve a father who doesn't make his living through violence and intimidation," Donata said, tears now streaming down her face. "I think they deserve to grow up without fear, without shame. I think they deserve normal." The word normal hung between them like an accusation. Vito had never been normal, had never wanted to be normal. Normal was the men who broke their backs in factories for pennies. Normal was the immigrants who accepted scraps from a society that looked down on them. Normal was powerlessness, and Vito had sworn as a hungry boy in Naples that he would never be powerless again. "You knew what I was when you married me," Vito said coldly. "Your father knew. Your whole family knew. They were happy enough to accept my money, my protection, my gifts. Now that you've lived in luxury for 16 years, suddenly you have moral objections?" "I was 18 years old," Donata shouted. "I didn't know what I was agreeing to. I didn't understand what this life really meant, but I understand now. And I won't let my daughters grow up the way I did, married off to the highest bidder, treated like property, living in constant fear." Maria appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. Is everything all right? "Leave us," Vito ordered without looking at her. The housekeeper vanished immediately. Vito walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered garden. His mind was racing, calculating options and outcomes. A divorce would be catastrophic for his reputation. The financial settlement would be substantial. New York courts were notoriously generous to wives, especially when children were involved. And if Donata started talking to lawyers, investigators, maybe even federal prosecutors, the potential damage was incalculable. But beyond the practical concerns, there was something deeper. Vito Genovese did not lose. He did not back down. He did not allow anyone, even his own wife, to dictate terms to him. "Here's what's going to happen," Vito said, turning back to face Donata. "You're going to forget about lawyers and divorce. You're going to continue being my wife, at least publicly. You'll attend the events you need to attend. You'll maintain this household, and you'll stop asking questions about my personal life. In return, you'll continue to live in comfort. The girls will have everything they need, and we'll maintain appearances." "And if I refuse?" Donata asked, though her voice had lost its earlier conviction. Vito met her eyes, letting her see the cold calculation there. "Then you'll discover that lawyers can be very unreliable. Cases can disappear. Evidence can vanish. And wives who make threats sometimes find that they have nowhere to go, no one who will help them." The threat was clear enough that Donata took a step backward. You would threaten me? Your own wife?" "I'm not threatening," Vito said quietly. "I'm explaining reality. You live in my world now, Donata. You have for 16 years. There's no escape from it, no going back to normal. The sooner you accept that, the easier things will be." Donata stared at him for a long moment, and Vito could see the exact instant when her defiance crumbled into despair. Her shoulders sagged, and fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. "I hate you," she whispered. "I hate what you've become. I hate what you've made me become." "Hate me if you want," Vito replied, unmoved. "But understand your situation. You have two choices. Accept things as they are, or face the consequences of trying to fight me. There is no third option." He walked past her toward the door, his appetite for dinner completely gone. At the doorway, he paused and looked back. Donata stood frozen by the table, her face in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. For just a moment, Vito felt something, not quite regret, but perhaps a recognition of what had been lost. There had been a time, early in their marriage, when he had cared for Donata, when her smile had meant something to him. But that was before the real power had come, before he understood what it took to survive and thrive in his world. Sentiment was a luxury he could no longer afford. Upstairs, Vito could hear his daughters getting ready for bed, their voices light and innocent. They were the one thing that still mattered, the only soft spot in his armored heart. Everything he did, all the risks he took, the empire he was building, it was for them, to give them opportunities he never had. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, where Marie and Antoinette shared a large bedroom decorated with dolls and books. They were in their nightgowns, and when they saw him, their faces lit up. "Papa!" Antoinette ran to him, and he caught her in his arms, lifting her off the ground despite her protests that she was too old for such treatment. Marie, more reserved at 14, smiled from her bed. "You're home early for once. I wanted to say goodnight to my girls," Vito said, setting Antoinette down and moving to sit on the edge of Marie's bed. "How was school today?" They talked for 20 minutes, his daughters telling him about their classes, their friends, their small dramas and triumphs. For this brief time, Vito could set aside the weight of his empire, the constant calculations and threats. Here, he was just a father, and his daughters looked at him with uncomplicated love. When he finally kissed them goodnight and turned off their lights, Vito felt the armor settling back over his heart. Tomorrow, he would deal with the union problem at the garment factories. He would oversee the shipment from New Jersey. He would maintain his empire through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and unwavering will, and he would decide what to do about his wife. As he descended the stairs, Vito saw Maria in the hallway, cleaning up the dinner that had barely been touched. She glanced at him nervously, then quickly looked away. "Maria," Vito said softly, "Mrs. Genovese isn't feeling well. She'll be taking her meals in her room for the next few days. Make sure she has everything she needs, but I want you to keep me informed of any visitors, any phone calls, understand?" The housekeeper nodded quickly. "Yes, Mr. Genovese, of course. And Maria, Mrs. Genovese is going through a difficult time. If she says things, Emotional things, they're just words. They don't mean anything. She wouldn't want anyone to take them seriously. Maria's eyes widened slightly as she grasped the full meaning of his words. She was being told to spy on her mistress, and also being warned that anything Donata might say to her should not be repeated to anyone outside the house. "I understand, Mr. Genovese," she whispered. Vito retrieved his coat and hat. Despite the late hour and the worsening weather, he needed to get out of this house, away from his wife's tears and accusations. He needed to be somewhere where he was respected, where his word was law, where nobody questioned his authority. He needed to see Anna. The drive to Anna Patillo's apartment took 40 minutes through the snow-clogged streets. She lived in a modest building in the East Village, a second-floor walk-up that her husband could barely afford. Gerard Vernotico was out tonight, running his small gambling operation, which meant Anna would be alone. Vito climbed the narrow stairs and knocked softly on the apartment door. It opened immediately, as if she had been waiting for him. Anna stood in the doorway wearing a green silk robe that matched her eyes, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. "I was hoping you'd come," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. The apartment was tiny compared to his townhouse. Just 3 small rooms furnished with inexpensive furniture, but it felt more like home than his grand house ever had. Here, he could breathe. Here he could be himself without the constant weight of reputation and respect. Anna poured him a glass of wine and sat beside him on the worn sofa. She didn't ask about his day or his business. She didn't make demands or complaints. She simply existed in his presence, her hand resting on his arm, her warmth radiating beside him. "You're troubled," she finally said. "I can see it in your face." Vito sighed, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "My wife, she wants a divorce. She's threatening to make things difficult." Anna was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on his sleeve. "What will you do?" It was the question that had been circling his mind all evening. What would he do? In his world, there were solutions to every problem. Some problems required negotiation, some required intimidation, and some required more permanent measures. "I don't know yet," Vito admitted, "but I'll figure it out. I always do." Anna leaned her head against his shoulder. "I wish things were different. I wish we could just be together, without all the complications." "Someday," Vito said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Someday things will be different." They sat together in comfortable silence as the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the city in white. In this moment, in this small apartment, Vito could pretend that life was simple, that he was just a man in love with a woman, without the weight of an empire on his shoulders. But tomorrow would come, and with it all the problems that needed solving, and Vito Genovese had never been one to avoid difficult decisions. March arrived in Manhattan with the promise of spring, though patches of gray snow still lingered in the shadows of buildings, refusing to surrender to the warming sun. The city seemed to be awakening from its winter slumber. Merchants opened their windows to let in fresh air. Children played stickball in the streets without their heavy coats, and the smell of fresh bread from bakeries mingled with the exhaust from passing automobiles. But for Vito Genovese, the changing season brought no relief from the problem that had been consuming his thoughts for weeks. Donata had not backed down. If anything, her resolve had hardened. She had stopped speaking to him entirely, communicating only through Maria when absolutely necessary. More concerning, she had been making phone calls. Maria had reported hearing her speaking in hushed tones from the upstairs telephone, always falling silent when anyone approached. Vito sat in the back room of the Bella Napoli, the familiar sanctuary where he conducted his most sensitive business. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the social club was nearly empty, except for a few old-timers playing cards in the front room. The radio played softly, broadcasting a baseball game, the announcer's voice providing a mundane backdrop to the discussion about to take place. Anthony Strallo, Tony Bender, sat across from Vito, his massive frame hunched forward as he nursed an espresso. Mike Miranda occupied a chair near the door, positioned where he could see anyone approaching. These were Vito's most trusted men, the ones who had proven their loyalty through years of service and countless tests. "The situation with your wife," Tony began carefully. "It's becoming a problem that people are starting to notice." Vito's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, waiting for Tony to continue. "The lawyer she contacted, we found out who he is. Bernard Stein, Manhattan practice, handles divorces for wealthy clients. He's smart, connected, and he doesn't scare easily. We sent someone to have a conversation with him, friendly-like, but he wouldn't budge. Said he has ethical obligations to his client." "Ethical obligations," Vito repeated, the words tasting bitter. "Everyone has ethics until they meet the right price or the right kind of pressure." Mike Miranda spoke up from his position by the door. "The problem is bigger than just the lawyer, boss. If this goes to court, if she starts talking about your business, your income, where the money comes from, the prosecutors will be very interested. The feds have been looking for an angle on you for years." Vito knew this better than anyone. He had been careful, more careful than most of his associates, maintaining legitimate business fronts and keeping his distance from the actual operations. But a divorce proceeding would require financial disclosures, depositions, testimony under oath. Even if Donata didn't deliberately cooperate with the authorities, The process itself would expose him to scrutiny he couldn't afford. There's also the matter of respect, Tony added quietly. Word is getting around that your wife is defying you, that she's threatening to air your private business in public. Some of the younger guys, the ones who don't know you as well, they're starting to whisper, wondering if you're losing your grip. This was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the situation. In Vito's world, perception was reality. A man who couldn't control his own household was a man who might not be able to control his territory, his crew, his operations. Weakness invited challenges, and challenges led to violence and instability. Vito stood and walked to the small window that looked out onto Mulberry Street. He watched a vendor arranging fresh vegetables on a cart, an old woman haggling over the price of tomatoes, a young couple walking arm in arm. These were his people, the community he protected and controlled. Everything he had built, everything he had become, rested on maintaining absolute authority. I've been thinking about this problem from every angle, Vito said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I've considered every option. Intimidation won't work. She's beyond that now. Paying her off would set a terrible precedent and still leave her free to talk. Legal maneuvering just drags things out and creates more exposure. He turned back to face his two most trusted associates, which leaves only one real solution. The room fell into a heavy silence. Tony and Mike exchanged glances, both understanding exactly what Vito was suggesting, but neither wanting to be the first to speak it aloud. Boss, Tony said carefully, we're talking about your wife, the mother of your children. This is different from business disputes or dealing with informants. This is personal. Everything is business, Vito replied coldly. When something threatens the organization, threatens our operations, threatens my position, it becomes a business problem that requires a business solution. The fact that she happens to be my wife is unfortunate, but it doesn't change the calculation. Mike Miranda shifted uncomfortably. The girls, boss, Marie and Antoinette, they'd be losing their mother. That's something that would stay with them forever. For a moment, something flickered across Vito's face. A shadow of doubt, perhaps, or a ghost of the man he had been before ambition and ruthlessness had consumed everything softer in his nature. He thought of his daughters, their innocent faces, the way they ran to him when he came home. How would he explain their mother's absence? How would he look them in the eyes knowing what he had done? But then he remembered Donata's threats, her defiance, the lawyer she had hired. He remembered the whispers among his men, the way some of them had started to look at him with barely concealed speculation. He remembered that in his world, mercy was interpreted as weakness, and weakness was fatal. My daughters will survive, Vito said, his voice hardening again. Children are resilient. They'll grieve, but they'll recover, and they'll still have their father, still have their home, still have everything I can provide for them. That's more than most children in this neighborhood have. Tony Bender leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. If you're serious about this, we need to be extremely careful. This can't look like anything other than an accident or a random act. No connection to you whatsoever. The police will investigate because of who you are, and they'll be looking for any excuse to tie it back to you. I understand that, Vito said impatiently. That's why I'm bringing this to you. I need it done professionally, cleanly, and I need complete distance from it. Mike Miranda stood and began pacing, his nervous energy filling the small room. We'd need to use someone from outside our crew, someone with no known connection to you or anyone close to you. And it needs to look random. A robbery gone wrong maybe, or a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. What about making it look like an accident? Tony suggested. A car crash maybe. Bad weather, slippery roads. Loses control. Happens all the time. Vito considered this, but shook his head. Too complicated. Too many things that could go wrong. Cars are unpredictable, and if she survives even for a few hours, she could talk. No. It needs to be quick and certain. The three men spent the next hour discussing logistics, speaking in the careful euphemisms and coded language they had perfected over years of conducting business that could never be spoken about openly. They talked about contractors instead of hired men, about closing the account instead of carrying out an execution, about resolving the situation instead of planning a woman's death. The plan that emerged was simple, which made it elegant. Donata had a routine. Every Thursday afternoon, she went to confession at St. Patrick's Church on Mott Street, the same church where she and Vito had been married. She always went alone, walking the 10 blocks from their townhouse because she claimed the exercise did her good. After confession, she would light candles for her parents, both deceased, and sometimes stop at a small cafe for coffee before walking home. Thursday is 5 days away, Mike noted. That gives us time to find the right person and set everything up properly. Tony nodded. I know a guy who works with the Irish crew in Hell's Kitchen, Polish fellow, ex-boxer, works for cash and doesn't ask questions. He's done this kind of work before, and he's never had any connection to our organization. How do we approach him? Vito asked. Through intermediaries. Tony replied. 3 layers of separation between you and him. He'll never know who the actual client is, and the people in the middle won't know the full details. Each person only knows their small piece. And payment? Cash, naturally. Paid in installments through the chain. $5,000 total. Half up front, half on completion. That's enough to ensure he takes it seriously, but not so much that it seems unusual or memorable. Vito pulled out his wallet and counted out 25 $100 bills. He placed them on the table, the stack of money representing a sum that most working men wouldn't see in 2 years. This covers the down payment and the intermediary fees. You handle the logistics, Tony. Mike, I want you to establish my whereabouts for that day. I need an ironclad reason to be somewhere very public with multiple witnesses. Mike nodded. There's a union meeting scheduled for Thursday at 2 o'clock, uptown at the Garment Workers Hall. Perfect timing. You'll be there, surrounded by at least 30 people discussing legitimate business. I'll make sure everyone remembers you were there. What about afterward? Tony asked. The investigation, the funeral arrangements, all of that. You'll need to play the grieving husband convincingly. Vito's expression darkened. I know how to play whatever role is necessary. I've been doing it my entire life. The meeting concluded with handshakes and silent nods. Tony and Mike left separately, each departing through different exits, a precaution they had learned years ago. Vito remained in the back room, sitting alone with his thoughts and a glass of whiskey. He told himself this was purely a practical decision, a necessary action to protect everything he had built. He told himself that Donata had brought this on herself through her threats and defiance. He told himself that in his position, any other choice would be seen as weakness, and weakness would destroy everything. But in the quiet moments, when he was alone with his conscience, Vito had to confront what he was truly doing. This wasn't eliminating a business rival or removing an informant. This was ordering the death of a woman he had once cared for, the mother of his children. Someone who had trusted him enough to bind her life to his. The weight of that decision settled over him like a physical thing, heavy and cold. But Vito Genovese had not risen to power by allowing sentiment to interfere with necessity. He had learned long ago that survival required hard choices, that power demanded sacrifice, and that mercy was a luxury only the weak could afford. He finished his whiskey and poured another, watching the amber liquid catch the light. In 5 days, Donata would walk to St. Patrick's Church for confession, seeking forgiveness for whatever small sins troubled her conscience. She would never arrive. A stranger would approach her on a quiet street. There would be a brief moment of violence, and then she would be gone. The police would investigate, of course, but they would find nothing. No witnesses willing to talk, no evidence connecting the crime to anyone in particular. Just another tragedy in a city where tragedies happened every day. Eventually, the investigation would grow cold, the file would be closed, and life would continue. Vito would play the grieving widower, attending the funeral with his daughters, accepting condolences from the community, perhaps even shedding a few tears for the cameras. And after an appropriate period of mourning, after the whispers died down and people moved on to the next scandal, he would be free to marry Anna Petillo. His empire would remain intact, his reputation preserved, his position secure. That evening, Vito returned home late, as had become his habit. The house was dark except for a single light in the upstairs hallway. Maria had left dinner in the warming oven. She had learned not to wait up for him anymore. He ate alone in the kitchen, the silence of the house pressing down on him. He climbed the stairs to check on his daughters, a nightly ritual he maintained no matter how late he returned. Marie was already asleep, her face peaceful in the soft glow of the nightlight. Antoinette stirred as he entered her room, her eyes fluttering open. "Papa?" she murmured sleepily. "Shh. Go back to sleep, Piccola," Vito whispered, kissing her forehead. "Is Mama all right?" Antoinette asked, her child's intuition sensing the tension that had filled the house for weeks. "She's been so sad lately." Vito's throat tightened. "Mama is fine. She's just tired. Everything will be better soon. I promise." It was a lie, but he told it smoothly, the way he told all his lies, with conviction and certainty. Antoinette smiled and closed her eyes, trusting completely in her father's words. As Vito walked down the hallway to his own bedroom, he passed Donata's room. She had moved to the guest room weeks ago, another sign of the complete breakdown of their marriage. Light showed under her door, and he could hear her moving around inside. For a moment he considered knocking, considered trying one more time to find a different solution. Perhaps there was still a way to reason with her, to make her understand that fighting him was futile. Perhaps there was still some remnant of the relationship they had once shared, some thread of connection that could be pulled to avoid what was coming. But then he remembered her threats, her lawyer, her determination to destroy him through the courts. He remembered the whispers among his men, the questioning looks, the erosion of respect that would accelerate if he was seen to back down now. Vito walked past her door without knocking. Some decisions, once made, could not be unmade. The machinery was already in motion. Money had changed hands, plans had been set, and in 5 days the problem would be resolved. He undressed in his own room and lay in bed staring at the ceiling as car headlights swept across the walls. Sleep came slowly, and when it finally arrived, it brought dreams of a younger Vito, freshly arrived in America, Still innocent enough to believe in possibilities, still soft enough to feel guilt. But that Vito Genovese was long dead, replaced by the man who understood that power required sacrifice, that survival demanded ruthlessness, and that in the end, the only loyalty that mattered was loyalty to oneself. Thursday would come, as Thursdays always did. The sun would rise over Manhattan, people would go about their daily routines, and somewhere in the distance, church bells would ring. And when the day ended, Vito Genovese would be one step closer to the life he wanted, purchased at a price only he would ever know. The next 5 days passed with agonizing slowness. Vito maintained his usual routines, attending meetings, overseeing operations, presenting the face of a man completely in control. But internally, he was counting down the hours, waiting for Thursday afternoon when everything would change. On Wednesday night, Tony Bender confirmed that all arrangements were in place. The contractor had been hired through the necessary intermediaries. He had been given a description of Donata, her typical route to the church, and the general time frame when she would be most vulnerable. He had been told only that this was a business matter, nothing personal, and that absolute discretion was required. Thursday morning arrived gray and overcast, with thick clouds promising rain by afternoon. Vito dressed carefully in a conservative dark suit, preparing for the union meeting that would serve as his alibi. He ate breakfast with his daughters, listening to Marie talk about an upcoming school dance, and Antoinette complained about her mathematics homework. Donata did not appear. She had been taking her meals in her room, avoiding him completely. It made things easier, really. No awkward final conversations, no last moments of eye contact that might haunt him later. At 1:30, Vito left for the union meeting, driven by Carmine Galante. The meeting hall was crowded with garment workers and shop stewards, all there to discuss wages and working conditions. Vito played his part perfectly, speaking when expected, listening attentively, making suggestions that seemed reasonable. More than 30 witnesses could place him there, far from Mott Street, far from any involvement in whatever was about to happen. While Vito sat in that union hall surrounded by witnesses, Donata Genovese left their townhouse at precisely 2:15, as was her Thursday custom. She wore a dark blue dress and a light coat, carrying her rosary beads in one hand. The sky had grown darker, and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. She never noticed the man who began following her 3 blocks from her house. She never saw him close the distance as she turned onto a quieter side street. She never knew that her husband, the father of her children, the man she had once loved, had decided that she was too dangerous to live. What happened next would be reported in the newspapers, investigated by the police, and whispered about in the neighborhood for years to come. But for Vito Genovese, sitting in that union meeting, projecting calm authority while discussing worker grievances, it was simply another problem being solved, another obstacle being removed from his path to absolute power. By the time the meeting ended at 4 o'clock, Donata Genovese's story was already over, and Vito's carefully constructed new life was about to begin. The phone call came at 4:30 in the afternoon, while Vito was still at the union hall, shaking hands and accepting thanks from the workers' representatives for his fair-minded approach to their concerns. Mike Miranda appeared in the doorway, his face carefully neutral, and caught Vito's eye with a subtle nod. Vito excused himself and followed Mike into a side office, closing the door behind them. "It's done," Mike said quietly, "but there's a complication. A witness, some kid delivering groceries, saw the whole thing. He ran, but the police have him now. He's giving a description." Vito felt his blood turn cold. How detailed? White male, medium build, dark coat, nothing that would pick someone out of a crowd, but enough that they'll be looking. The contractor got away clean, but the cops are all over the scene. Where did it happen? Corner of Hester and Mott, 2 blocks from the church. Quick, professional, but the timing was unlucky. The kid came around the corner at exactly the wrong moment. Vito processed this information rapidly. A witness was problematic, but not necessarily fatal to the plan. A vague description wouldn't lead anywhere, especially if the contractor had already left the city as instructed. The key was to maintain his composure, to react exactly as a shocked and grieving husband would react. "I need to get home," Vito said, his voice carefully pitched to sound concerned, but not panicked. "My wife was supposed to be going to church this afternoon. If something happened in that neighborhood," Mike nodded, playing his role perfectly. "I'll drive you myself, boss. I'm sure it's nothing, but we should check." They left the union hall with appropriate haste, quick but not frantic, concerned but not guilty. The drive downtown took 20 minutes through afternoon traffic, and with each passing block, Vito could see more police cars, more activity. By the time they reached Little Italy, the entire neighborhood was swarming with uniformed officers. A crowd had gathered on Hester Street, held back by police barriers. Vito pushed through, Mike at his side, until a uniformed officer stopped them. "Sorry, sir. You can't go any further. This is a crime scene." "My wife," Vito said, his voice breaking just enough to sound authentic. She was walking to church. Someone told me something happened. Please, I need to know if she's all right. The officer's expression shifted from bureaucratic firmness to sympathy. What's your wife's name, sir? Vito Genovese. She was wearing a blue dress carrying rosary beads. Please tell me what happened. The officer turned and called over a detective. A tired-looking man in his 50s with gray hair and a rumpled suit. Detective Frank Morrison had been working organized crime cases for 20 years, and he knew exactly who Vito Genovese was. Mr. Genovese, Morrison said, his tone neutral. I'm sorry to inform you that a woman matching your wife's description was attacked on this street approximately 2 hours ago. She was taken to Bellevue Hospital, but he paused, genuine regret crossing his features. I'm very sorry, she didn't survive. Vito let his knees buckle slightly and Mike caught him, supporting his weight. It was a calculated performance, but there was something genuine in it too. Shock at the finality of it, the irrevocable nature of what he had set in motion. No, Vito whispered. No, that's not possible. I just saw her this morning. She was fine. She was going to church just like every Thursday. This doesn't make sense. I know this is difficult, Morrison said, his experienced eyes watching Vito's reaction carefully. But we need you to come to the hospital to make a formal identification. And then we'll need to ask you some questions. Standard procedure in cases like this. Vito nodded numbly, allowing Mike to guide him back to the car. As they drove to Bellevue Hospital, Vito stared out the window, his mind racing behind the mask of grief. A witness was a problem, but not an insurmountable one. The contractor would be long gone by now, probably already on a train to Chicago or Boston. The chain of intermediaries would hold. None of them knew enough to connect the dots back to Vito. The hospital was cold and sterile, smelling of disinfectant and death. Morrison led them to the morgue, where a sheet-covered form lay on a metal table. The detective pulled back the sheet, revealing Donata's face. Her eyes were closed, her expression peaceful, as if she were merely sleeping. Is this your wife? Morrison asked formally. Vito looked at the woman he had been married to for 16 years, the woman who had borne his children, the woman whose elimination he had ordered as casually as he might order dinner. For a moment, he felt nothing, just a strange emptiness, as if he were observing the scene from outside his own body. Yes, he finally said, his voice hoarse. That's Donata. That's my wife. Morrison covered her face again and led them to a small office where the questioning could begin. For the next 2 hours, Vito answered questions with the perfect balance of grief and cooperation. Where had he been that afternoon? At a union meeting, with dozens of witnesses. When had he last seen his wife? That morning at breakfast. Had there been any problems in their marriage? Nothing unusual. The normal stresses any couple faced. Did she have any enemies? Of course not. She was a good woman, devoted to her family and church. Mr. Genovese, Morrison said carefully, I have to ask this. Given your mom business associations, is it possible this was directed at you? A message from rivals, perhaps? Vito met the detective's eyes steadily. Detective, I run legitimate businesses. I'm a businessman, nothing more. My wife had nothing to do with any of that. She was an innocent woman who went to church every Thursday. If someone targeted her, it was random. Wrong place, wrong time, maybe a robbery attempt that went bad. Morrison didn't look convinced, but he had no evidence to support any other theory. We have a witness, a delivery boy who saw a man fleeing the scene. We're working on a composite sketch. If we find this person, if there's any connection to you or your associates, Mr. Genovese, we will discover it. I hope you do, Vito said with apparent sincerity. I want justice for my wife. Whatever resources I have, whatever influence I can bring to bear, I'll use it to help find whoever did this. It was a masterful performance, and even Morrison, cynical after decades of dealing with criminals, couldn't quite pierce through it. The detective had his suspicions. He wasn't naive about who Vito Genovese really was, but suspicions weren't evidence. And without evidence, there was nothing he could do. Vito was allowed to leave the hospital just after 7 o'clock. The first thing he did was go home to his daughters. Marie and Antoinette were in the parlor with Maria, who had heard the news and was weeping quietly. The girls looked up when their father entered, their faces full of confusion and fear. Papa? Marie asked, her voice trembling. Maria said something happened to Mama. She said. Vito knelt down and gathered both daughters into his arms, holding them as they began to cry. This part wasn't performance. His girls were genuinely suffering, and despite everything, despite the coldness that had grown in his heart, he felt their pain. Your mama had an accident, he said softly, stroking their hair. She was walking to church, and something terrible happened. She's gone, my darlings. She's with God now. Their sobs filled the house, and Vito held them until they were exhausted, until their tears had run dry and they fell into restless sleep on the sofa. He carried them upstairs one at a time, tucking them into their beds with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the ruthlessness that defined his professional life. The funeral was held 4 days later at St. Patrick's Church, the same church where Vito and Donata had been married, the same church she had been walking to when her life ended. The turnout was massive. Hundreds of people from the neighborhood, business associates, family members from both sides. The church could barely contain the crowd. Vito played his role perfectly, the grieving widower supported by his two heartbroken daughters. He accepted condolences with appropriate dignity, his eyes red but dry, his posture strong but somehow diminished. People whispered about what a tragedy it was, how random violence could strike anyone, how even the powerful weren't safe from the cruelty of the city. Detective Morrison attended the funeral, watching from the back of the church. He observed Vito's interactions, looking for any sign of guilt, any crack in the facade, but he found nothing. Either Vito Genovese was genuinely grief-stricken, or he was the best actor Morrison had ever encountered. The investigation continued for weeks, but it went nowhere. The composite sketch based on the delivery boy's description could have matched thousands of men in New York. The contractor who had actually committed the act had vanished. He had taken his money and left the state, never to return. The intermediaries in the chain knew nothing useful, and the ones who might have known something weren't talking. The code of silence, omerta, held firm. Nobody in Little Italy was going to cooperate with the police investigation, especially when the victim was connected to Vito Genovese. People understood that showing too much interest in such matters was dangerous for one's health. By June, the investigation had stalled completely. Morrison knew in his gut that Vito was responsible, but gut feelings didn't hold up in court. Without evidence, without witnesses willing to testify, without any concrete connection between Vito and the crime, the case was effectively closed. 3 months after Donata's death, Vito began appearing publicly with Anna Petillo. Her husband, Gerard Vernetico, had conveniently agreed to a quiet divorce, encouraged by a generous financial settlement and an understanding that refusing would be very unwise for his future prospects. The neighborhood whispered, of course. The timing seemed suspicious, the relationship too convenient, but nobody said anything directly and nobody went to the authorities. This was the way things worked in their world. Powerful men made their own rules, and those who challenged them tended to disappear. In December of 1937, 9 months after Donata's death, Vito Genovese married Anna Petillo in a private ceremony. His daughters attended, still mourning their mother, but adapting as children do, accepting Anna with the resilience of youth. Vito had achieved exactly what he wanted. His problematic wife was gone, eliminated without any consequences. He had remarried the woman he desired. His reputation, after a brief period of whispered speculation, remained intact. If anything, the tragedy had generated sympathy. The poor widower, trying to rebuild his life after such a devastating loss. Detective Morrison retired 2 years later, the Genovese case remaining one of his few unsolved investigations. On his last day, he pulled out the file one more time, looking at the photos of Donata Genovese's peaceful face in death, reading through the witness statements that led nowhere, reviewing the composite sketch that had never identified anyone. "I know you did it," Morrison said quietly to the empty office, as if Vito could somehow hear him. "I know you ordered your own wife's death, and I know you got away with it. But God sees everything, Mr. Genovese, and someday, somehow, you'll answer for this." But Vito Genovese never did answer for Donata's death. He continued his rise through the ranks of organized crime, eventually becoming one of the most powerful mob bosses in American history. He lived by his own code, made his own rules, and demonstrated that in his world, with enough money and power and ruthlessness, a man truly could place himself above the law. The lesson was clear and chilling. In the underworld of 1930s Manhattan, even the most sacred bonds, marriage, family, trust, meant nothing when they conflicted with ambition and self-preservation. Vito Genovese had proven that he would sacrifice anything and anyone to maintain his power, and in doing so, he had secured his position at the top of a criminal empire built on fear, violence, and absolute loyalty. His daughters grew up never knowing the truth about their mother's death. His new wife, Anna, gave him the companionship he craved. His empire expanded, his wealth multiplied, and his reputation as a man not to be crossed became legend. In the end, Vito Genovese had calculated correctly. The price of Donata's life was his freedom, his power, and his future. And in the cold arithmetic of the criminal underworld, it was a price he had been willing to pay without hesitation or remorse.